Guys, welcome back for the last section of chapter 5. Today we're going to be talking about shifts in supply. So moving on. We'll talk a little bit about input costs and how they create changes in supply. We'll look at the way that the government can actually influence the supply of goods, and then, as I mentioned already, we'll discuss some other factors that can either increase or decrease supply. All right, so just 3 vocab words for this section, and all of them have to do with government action. So the first is a subsidy. And a subsidy is a government payment that supports a business or a market. So a subsidy can apply to an entire industry. It can apply to just a specific business. One example of a type of subsidy that's really important in our part of the country would be like agricultural subsidies. So money given to farmers to help them kind of stay in business and do their thing, especially when prices are low, because we want to keep that food supply up, right? An excise tax is a tax on the production or sale of a certain good, and usually excise taxes are used to discourage consumer behavior. So for example, there's excise taxes on the sale of alcohol, on the sale of tobacco, so on and so forth. And then there's regulations. So regulations are government interventions in a market that affect the production of a good. So one market that's heavily regulated would be like the pharmaceutical industry, because we want to make sure that the goods that they're producing are safe for consumers. Likewise, there's lots of regulations in like air traffic, right? Travel via airplane. Those industries are greatly impacted by government regulations as well. Again, this lots of times has to do with consumer safety, meeting safety standards. So, why does the supply curve shift? So, we talked about demand and why that shifts. Now we're going to talk about supply. And when these two curves interact and the curves shift, it can ultimately lead to an increase or decrease in price. And I'll show you guys kind of how that works. We'll bring it all together in an assignment where we'll look at a number of different scenarios. So shifts in the demand curve happen because of changes dealing with consumers, right? So like consumer trends or change in the population, so change in the number of consumers, so on and so forth. But today we're going to be looking at why the supply curve shifts, which has more to do with supply. So let's see here. We're going to talk about rising costs, rising input costs. So what do my raw materials cost? That could affect supply. Changes in technology, government influence, expectations of prices can also play a part. The number of suppliers in a given market could play a part, and then just changes really in the global economy. So we'll start with rising costs. And the acronym that I'm going to give you for changes in supply is ROTTEN. So starting with R, rising costs, any change in the cost of an input used to make a good will have an impact on supply. So if the cost of the raw materials increase, then we're going to see a decrease in supply because the good has become more expensive to produce. So there's a high input cost for dairy farmers for their feed, their labor, their fuel, right? All of these sort of raw materials that they need to produce milk is going to have an impact on the price of milk and the supply of milk. Okay, one of your T's is technology. So for technology, if costs continue to rise, a firm is going to have to cut production or figure out a way to lower their marginal cost, which again is how much money does it cost to produce one good, right, or one service. So lots of times what they do to counteract the rising input costs is they advance technology. And oftentimes advancing technology can actually lower your production costs. So maybe previously you needed like 14 people to produce a, cell phone, right? They're all doing little like assembly line type things. And maybe now you find a way to automate that process using technology, and you just need one person to oversee the production of that item, right? They need to oversee that the machine is doing its job. It's a technological advance that has brought you from 14 workers down to one that saved your company money, and now you've kind of offset the other rising costs within your industry. Right, so some examples of technological advances would include automation, computers, even something as simple as email. Lots of businesses, stores used to have to advertise using paper flyers in the newspaper or sending out catalogs. And now they can send you like an email like 5 times a day, right? And that is virtually free for them, besides paying the cost of someone having to write that email, right? Paying some labor cost. But they don't have to pay for the paper or things like that as they would have had to previously. All right, so far we have R, rising costs. We have T, our first T, which was technology, and your second T is going to be taxes, which should hopefully be a cue for you to think about how the government can influence supply. So in addition to input costs, the federal government also has the power to affect suppliers in multiple different ways. So one would be taxes. Excise taxes are going to increase production costs by adding an extra cost for every unit that's sold. Oftentimes, like I said, they're used to discourage the sale of a good that the government deems harmful, like cigarettes or alcohol. Now, sometimes suppliers will try and pass off that cost to consumers just by increasing the cost of that item. In addition, the government can pass subsidies where the government is giving money to the producers of a good, which generally is going to lower their cost and thus can increase supply. So that allows a firm to produce more goods. Some reasons for subsidizing products would include like providing food during food shortages would be like a goal. Right now, they may provide pharmaceutical companies with subsidies so that they can develop a COVID vaccine. They may enact subsidies to help protect like younger industries, say like industries like technology, to protect those industries from foreign competition, so on and so forth. In addition, the government can pass regulations, and indirectly, oftentimes government regulation has the effect of raising costs. So when the government regulated the auto industry, for example, to cut down on pollution, that regulation led to an increase in the cost of manufacturing cars. So they needed to figure out how are we going to make cars that are more economical, that are better for the environment, so on and so forth. And that whole process costs money. All right, and then we have E. So the first part of E is the economy. So when we have changes in the global economy, that can have an impact on supply because many goods and services are imported from other countries. So the economic situation that's playing out in other countries can affect the supply of those goods. So think of how many items we import from like China, right? So if China's economy is in shambles, that can affect supply for us we can have shortages as a result of that. So an increase in wages in one country or an increase in the supply of a good in another can cause the overall supply curve to shift. Additionally, if there's any restrictions on imports, taxes, for example, that could also impact supply because foreign suppliers may not like the idea of paying taxes on goods and then they may decide not to trade with us. So that's why we oftentimes set up like free trade agreements, so on and so forth, because those sorts of deals can have an impact on supply. So when we have a shift in the supply curve, just like with the demand curve, we shift the supply curve to the right or to the left. So an increase in supply is going to result in a rightward shift, while a decrease in supply is going to be indicated by a leftward shift. So it asks, which graph best represents the effect of higher costs? So if a business has higher costs, that's rising costs, that is going to decrease their supply because they are not going to make as many goods because each of those goods that they make costs more money. So that would be a decrease. Which graph best represents advances in technology? We can produce more due to technology, right? So that would be indicated by an increase in supply. So, expectations. We talked with demand about consumer expectations, but producer expectations about price can also have an impact when it comes to supply and demand. So if a seller expects the price of a good to rise in the future, the seller is going to store the goods now in order to sell more in the future. So if they expect that the price of Lysol wipes is going to increase, they're going to keep more in inventory right now. So when the price does increase, they can then have a higher supply, push that out, sell that for more money. If the prices of goods are expected to drop in the near future, the sellers are going to earn more if they place goods on the market immediately before the price falls. So they want to try and sell as fast as they can. So in regards to this checkpoint question, what happens to supply if the price of a good is expected to rise in the future? In the future, we may have more supply, but for now, in current supply, we are going to see a decrease because suppliers are going to put more of that product in inventory, and that's not going to be available for purchase by consumers. And then N. N is a number of suppliers. So if more suppliers enter the market supply is going to increase and the supply curve is going to shift to the right. If suppliers stop producing a good and they leave the market, market supply is going to decline, causing the supply curve then to shift to the left. All right, so to kind of sum it up here, these are the different things that can have an impact on supply. So we talked about rising costs, rising input costs, which can include or oftentimes does include changes in price of other goods. So we talked about the dairy example. So if the price of fuel changes, it's going to be more expensive for a dairy farmer to run their machinery, so on and so forth. So those two R and O, they kind of go together, right? T is going to be technology. Remember, advances in technology oftentimes will increase in supply. And then the second T would be taxes, subsidies, and regulations. So each of those three government interventions can have an impact on supply, right? If there's an increase in taxes, oftentimes we're going to see a decrease in supply, where If a company gets subsidies, we'll often see an increase in supply, so on and so forth. For E, we have the economy. We talked about the global economy and as well as the expectations of suppliers in regards to future price. And then additionally, talked about the number of suppliers and the impact that that can have on supply. So the more suppliers, the more supply, the less suppliers, the less supply. So when is a firm likely to locate close to its customers? This is kind of unrelated to shifts in supply, but the question here is asking, like, why would a firm decide to build a factory or a warehouse in Fargo versus Minneapolis if their main market is Fargo, right? So a key factor in where a firm will locate its goods is transportation. So when inputs such as raw materials are really expensive to transport, a firm will put the location of their factory close to the inputs. So if you are manufacturing lumber, for example, wood for building things, it's probably really expensive to transport dead trees, right? So you may decide to build your factory close to the trees, close to the forest, and then ship out your final product because that's going to be the cheaper option for you, right? And so if the raw materials are expensive to transport, a firm is going to locate close to the raw materials. If the output or the final product is more expensive to transport, then firms are going to locate closer to the consumer. So in regards to this checkpoint question, the answer would be when the final product is more expensive to transport, then a firm would likely locate close to consumers. So that was kind of a random addition that they talked briefly about in section 3. But that is it for chapter 5. We'll do some practice with supply and demand scenarios and kind of bring these two worlds together. And that is it. Please let me know if you have questions.